Okay, now it's working. I'm gonna need to update Zoom. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now, and we're going to spend a little more time on, is functions. So let's just talk about the syntax in JavaScript. There's a lot of different syntaxes. I'm going to just use one for right now, for today. So you might see other different ways to write functions in JavaScript, but to keep things simple, I'm going to keep it this one way. You can see my screen, right? Cool. So with functions, I can actually, I'm going to store them as a const. So I do const, and then I give it the function name, camel case if it needs to be. I set this equal to, these curly brackets, and then I can do my params. So just kind of like a generic. And then I do, this one's called like an arrow function syntax. So this arrow function syntax. So let's do a basic one. Let's just, have a function say hello. So this equals a function. So what I'm saying, hey, this say hello, this is a variable, this equals a function. Then here we can just do our stuff, console.log, hello. Okay. And then to call a function, let's just do this. Let's do it like we would in Ruby. And nothing happens. So in JavaScript, this does not actually call the function. I actually have to call it with the parentheses. But this is just the same. This is our function definition. And here you'll hear these terms, we invoke it or we call it. Kind of hear those two terms, we invoke the function or we call the function. We can do that multiple times. Cool. So nothing new here, just some different syntax versus Ruby.
Since it's a constant, should the say be capitalized or does that matter?
Yeah, this is a little, it's no, not with functions. We'll actually, this is a little tricky one to explain because we will make when we make, a lot of times in JavaScript, we'll declare things as constants, but we won't capitalize them. And the distinction here is like, so something like pi. Pi is a number that should never change. But I might want to declare something a constant in my code, just because like in my code, that name should not change in like that function. But it might be a different value. Like a name could be a different value, right? It's kind of hard. Like I might declare something like a name, a const, because I don't want it to change in my code. But name's not really a constant. Or it could have multiple values. Something like pi is a constant, and I'm always going to want it to have the same value. So we'll see some examples of that. So for now, I'm just going to say no. We don't want to have this capitalized. We just kind of name it like we would a variable.
Okay, I'll go with it.
Think like a lot of this stuff, you kind of have to kind of get exposed to some of the ideas, and then you can kind of go into like the details. It's it's kind of hard to like focus on the details without kind of the high level stuff. But if I find an example, I'll kind of show you what I mean. Okay, so we have this say hello, and we run this. So if I want to pass this function a parameter, like I said, we can just throw these in here. So let's say this function now is going to take a name. Now, if I want to interpolate this, I have to use the backticks. And then I can say hello name. Say hello with name. So now I have this say hello with name function. Cool. Nothing new here, right? Just a little different syntax. It's pretty much the only difference right here. Let's do like our add function that we did with Ruby. Num1, num2. Num1 plus num2. And then I can say like, let sum, or here's an example. I could declare this a const. Const sum equals add 1 and 1. So I'm going to declare this variable a const because maybe in my app I don't want this sum to ever change. So I'm just making it here and I don't want it to change. But sum's not really like, the value could be different, right? If these numbers change. So sum could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like sum could be any value, but I don't want that to change in my code. Pi itself, pi should never change. Pi is always 3.14. But my sum could be any value, but I don't want someone to later in the code reassign it. So that's why I can do that. And we'll see we declare things const a lot in JavaScript just because we don't want them to be reassigned. Yeah, that's a little more nuanced thing to talk about. So here's how we do this in Ruby, right? We have our add function. It takes 2 parameters, num1, num2. We return the result. We can throw that into a variable, bam, and we can log it. But I tried to log this and I'm getting undefined. Now something that's Ruby, so remember functions, this is like the takeaway. This is functions take in parameters. I mean, they, 0 to n. Like you can have a function take in as many parameters as you want. They don't have to take in like our say hello. This doesn't have any parameters. This one has 1. This one has 2. We could have it have like 20. That's probably way too much, but our functions can take in parameters, and then our functions can return.
So is the say hello, is that a const? No, is that a variable? Like you're setting something to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a variable. So it's something we can't really do. Like it's a variable, but it's a function, but I can store that function to a variable. This is where JavaScript gets, I can store this to a variable and we'll see some examples. So then I can then like pass this function to other functions and we can do a lot of stuff with functions. JavaScript is, we can do functional programming with JavaScript, and functional programming is pretty powerful, but we kind of have to get through some basics first. So I have this add function, but here's functions, and this is in Ruby and JavaScript and every language. Functions take in parameters and they can return one thing. So functions have a return, they return something. This one I'm trying to return num1 plus num2. But with JavaScript, I actually have to use the return keyword. Ruby, that's optional. Unless I want, Ruby will automatically return the last thing in a function. JavaScript doesn't. So if I don't have the return keyword here, JavaScript is going to return undefined. So that's kind of like the either or. It's going to return the thing you tell it to return, or JavaScript's going to return undefined from functions. So this is returning undefined. Well, I want this to return the sum, so I use that return keyword. There we go. There's 4. So let's do like a let's actually make this a little, I'll leave that the same. But let's make another function called let's just call it math. So this takes a num1, num2, and then takes a operator. And then we can do something like this, like if operator equals plus, we can return that. Else, and then, it's always confusing going back between Ruby and JavaScript. Else. Let's just do minus by default. Or let's do an else if, because I want to kind of show one thing here. So if operator equals minus, then we'll do minus. And else we'll say like console.log invalid input. So I'm kind of writing this in a weird way because I want to kind of look at some things here. So let's say const math or const, whatever. Let's call this x math, and then we'll call our math function. We'll give it 1 and 1, and then a plus sign. We can do y, do the minus.
So what's the 1 and 1 plus? Cause I'm confused because maybe it's just because we were jumping so quick to something different than Ruby. So it's 1 and 1 and the plus?
Yeah, this is really the exact same in Ruby. The syntax is a little different. I'm just defining a function. This function can take 3 parameters. So 1, 2, 3, and then I'm calling it. So this 1 becomes this number 1. This 1 becomes this number 2. This string plus becomes the operator. So if operator equals this plus string, we'll then return num1, which in this case would be 1 and 1. So here's my method definition. I'm defining my method, and then I'm just defining the logic inside of here. I mean, I can call this math. Functions are just kind of their own little apps in a way. So this is kind of like this self-contained thing I'm creating that now I can reuse. And this math, it's going to take 3 parameters. I can call these whatever. To call that A. then when I call my math function, I need to give it those 3 arguments. And then my math is going to then take those and just do whatever I say to do with those. So for example, with this one, when I actually call the function here, I'll just change these different numbers so I don't say 1 a whole bunch. So when I call math here, this 3 is going to become this number 1. This 6 is going to become this number 2. This plus is going to become this operator. So in this case, the operator is going to be plus. This is going to be true. So go ahead and return 3 plus 6. So this one I should expect 9. This case, my operator is a minus. So it should hit this case, which should return num1 minus num2, which would be 2 minus 2. So that should be 0. So here's my question here. If I type in A, so A is not plus or minus, so I'm going to console.log invalid input. What is this going to return?
Invalid input.
So this is where I think, because does anyone else have any ideas? I think that's a very logical response, but it's technically not correct.
It should, like, as far as the return word, it should return undefined.
Yeah, because remember with JavaScript, and even it would be the same thing with Ruby. If we're doing a put statement, like puts is not returning. Puts is doing something. It's like doing a function to put something out to the console. So with JavaScript, we're not actually returning this string. We're calling the function. And then we get down here and we're not returning anything. So by default, if we don't return anything, JavaScript will return undefined.
So because you didn't return that, it's just an error, I guess, right?
No, it's not an error. I don't have to return anything from a function in JavaScript. It's not a rule. Like in this say hello function and this say hello with name, I'm fine with just not returning anything because all they're doing is logging to the console. But they will return undefined. So let's go ahead and like test this out. So I have X, Y, and Z. So let's just console.log these. I kind of hate how Ruby has that implicit return. I think it's really confusing when you're learning. I wish they didn't. So there we go. There's our 9. There's our 0. And then there's our undefined. It still logs invalid input. So we log the invalid input message. But then here it technically returns undefined. I could also, like if I returned, but I could also, maybe I don't want to log that to the console. And actually I probably wouldn't want to. Instead, I could return invalid input and not log it here. Now it returns the string invalid input. Here's another little kind of got you or little trick. So I really don't need an if else statement. I can do this with just an if statement. Let me show you how to rewrite this in probably in a more clean way. Let's call this math 1. Because remember, if I return from a function, it stops. We can only return one thing from a function. So if I return, I mean, think of kind of what that word means, like return, like we're done, return this, and then we're done. So I really don't need an else if, I just need an if. And I don't even need an else here. This is a cleaner way to write this function. Because if the operator equals plus, then we just return this. If it equals minus, then we return that. Else we return invalid input. Because if it hits one of these, it's going to stop. So I'll throw these two examples out in Slack. They would work the same. These would both, as far as their functionality, they would be the exact same. Questions on that?
Is that like an ES6 way of writing an if statement, or is that just another way to do it?
You mean without the if else?
Yeah.
No, this is just how functions work. And let's actually, I think what would be a good demo is to do this in Ruby.
Does invalid input not need the brackets around it?
This one?
Yeah.
That would, because if I return invalid input, that's an error, because invalid.
Sorry, I meant like the yellow brackets.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. The yellow brackets, that's defining my function. So this is the start of my function. This is the end of my function.
Sorry, I mean the other yellow brackets. The not squiggled.
Wait.
Like below where it says math 3.6.
Oh, does this need it here? That one?
No, does invalid input need what you just took away up around that, or does it not in JavaScript?
What line are you talking about?
Return invalid input right there.
Yeah. The squiggly brackets?
No, the yellow ones you just deleted and put back around the 3.6. Do you need the same ones around invalid input?
If you need parentheses around invalid input.
Oh, this. Sorry, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
No.
You don't need this. Okay.
So do you not have to put else on that last return?
No, I mean, I could 100%. I could do else.
Okay.
That would work the same.
But it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's not, because it's just how this return works from a function. Because if the operator is a minus, we're going to return right here, which means this is going to be done. So it's a way we can check. If it's a plus, do the math. If it's plus, do the addition and return it, and then we're done. If it's not a plus, then check to see if it's a minus. If it is a minus, then do the subtraction, return the result, and then the function's done. So if it's not a plus or a minus, then we didn't hit any of these returns. Then we can just return, hey, that was invalid input.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, let's do this in Ruby, because this, I really just want to like hammer home this like return part of a function. So in Ruby, this would be def math. And yeah, we'd have our num1, num2, and I'll just call that OP for operator, and then end. So we could do our operator. If our operator equals plus, then we'll do an else if. So we'll do this kind of both ways. Else if OP equals minus. So I need to do double equals. Has anyone accidentally done this in their code, where you're trying to do a conditional and you only use one equal sign?
I have done that, yes.
Yeah, I do that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm still not used to it.
So this is going to, because what's going to happen here is this is actually going to try to assign your variable to this value. So this is doing assignment. Yeah, that's going to not give you the result you want. So we need to make sure we're checking for equality. All right. So here I can do num1 plus num2, and I don't need the return because Ruby is going to implicitly return these things. But I'm going to kind of show you why I don't really like this. Okay. So here it is in Ruby. Then, I can do math, 2 and 2 and the plus. Let's do minus, and let's do A. Let's just see that I'm getting the expected results. And before we run these, let's kind of just do these in our head. So on this one, I have a plus sign and 2 and 2. So we're going to hit this statement, and then we do num1 and num2. And that's really going to be the last thing that happens. So it's going to return that. So that would be 4. Right? If we do this one, we do the minus. That's a minus 2 and 2. Oops, let's do subtraction there. And then that'll be the last thing we've done. So this one will be 0. Now for this one, 2, 2, and A, well, we're not going to hit this if statement or this else if statement. We're going to hit this one. So this one's going to be invalid input. Then we can see if I'm right. Oh, I don't want to do node. I want to do Ruby demo.rb. And I need to call that one
num2.
Okay, so there we go. 4, 0, invalid input. So let's go ahead and write that the other way, how I did in the other one with the just the if statement, and kind of do it the cleaner way. But now we're going to see, kind of see a pretty important distinction here. So, right, if I run this, here's my question. Is this going to be the same or is it going to be different?
I bet it'll be different because you said the thing about the returning always the last line.
Yeah, so this is always going to return the last line. So if I do it this way, and let me call this math 1. So let's say we go through this first thing, this 2, 2, and plus. So we go ahead, the operator is going to be plus. We're going to do this. We're going to do 2 plus 2. That's just going to be 4. And really, we're not going to do anything with this 4. It's just going to, like, the computer is going to do the math, and then this 4 is going to disappear because we're not storing this to a variable or anything. Then we're going to go down to the second if, and then we're going to go down to this invalid input. And then our app's going to return invalid input. So we run this, and we get all invalid inputs.
Why is it doing that again? I'm a little confused, sorry.
No, that's fine, because Ruby, so Ruby is going, and this is why Ruby implicitly returns the last thing it ran in the function. So in this case, the last thing it ran was this, or the last thing
okay.
Invalid input, so it returns it. In here, we have this all stuck in an if, else, if. So only, remember with an if, else, if, only one of these things is going to get run. Only one of these things is going to get hit. So here it is even though I don't have the return keyword, like these are getting returned correctly. Because I'm only going to do one of these things. Here I actually do an if statement, but then that if statement's end. So then I go down to the next one. I check that one. And then whether or not it's true or not, we're always going to hit this last line of code. So that's what it's going to return. But then I just said, you know, like, this is really the cleaner way to write this function. I actually, like, at my last company, one of like the senior developers, like, if I would have had code like this, he would have said, hey, rewrite this so you don't have an if else. He'd be like, you can just write that with if statements. That was kind of like a convention he was trying to start at the company. So how would I do that in Ruby? So I can't do it this way, but I got to get this one working.
Would you do when?
What?
Would you do when? Like the,
Or
like the case when, you know what I mean? Or you declare it as a case or whatever instead?
that, I mean, yeah, that would do it, but that kind of still be like an if else statement. So that would work. I think a case statement or when would work. But how would I keep it like this if I just want to do the if statement?
You would add a return into each of the if statements so that it leaves the if statement.
Yeah, exactly. So this one I would actually have to say return. So now if I hit this one, then I'm going to say return, and then that's going to stop the function. If I hit this one, then I'm going to say return, and then that will stop the function. And since this is the last thing in the function, right here, I technically don't need the return. And now that one works as expected. So if I'm like a lazy Ruby developer and I want to write as little code as possible, this is how I could do it. But I think when you're learning, this is, I like, you know, to like say, you know, I'm returning this, because returning stops the function and it returns the value and it stops the function. But technically, I don't need that return there in Ruby. And let's see what happens if I do a puts here. See, if I do a puts is a function that returns nil. So puts doesn't return the string. Puts is a function that puts something to your console, and then it's not going to return what you have in here. So if I actually want to return the string, I could still puts that out, but then I could return, you know, error or something. But if I'm just returning the puts, that's going to be nil. So that's the difference between putting something to the console and returning it from the function. I can comment that out. Returns nil. So if I were describing the puts function, it, you know, logs message to console and returns nil. So does that, this is really just kind of like a demo in the return keyword. Does that help that kind of sink in? And the return, the difference between JavaScript and Ruby is if Ruby will return the last thing that it did. In JavaScript, it won't. If you don't say return in JavaScript, the function will just, if you don't give it anything to return, it will return undefined. But both of them have the return keyword, and both of them, the return key will stop the function when you hit that. So I'm going to select this one out too, so you can look at that example. And once again, coding is not, it's not really about like, it's so much more about just like copying and pasting it and getting it working. It's kind of going through this in your head, kind of going line by line and trying to understand what's going on. That's how you really get good at coding. It's kind of like a slow, painful process of like trying to wrap your head around like kind of these small differences. And that's where it's good to like, you know, work with a partner, try to explain this to someone, because it's a lot more difficult when you have to try to explain this to someone. So it's kind of like that rubber ducky method. So even if you're just talking to yourself, try to explain it to yourself out loud. Or another good way to explain it is with comments. So you can just, you know, write a comment here like code, like function will stop here because of return. And here I could say like, don't need return because Ruby will implicitly return this. So go ahead and like, while you're learning, like really just comment your code so much just to explain to yourself what's happening. I think that's a good way to kind of really, you know, grasp these concepts. Like here, have to have the return because JS does not implicitly return last thing. Cool. All right, let's keep going with functions in JavaScript. I'm gonna comment this stuff out. Okay, so let's do this and then we'll take a break and then we'll kind of use this concept next. But let's say I have a function. Let's just keep this simple, like say, or let's just write a function called log. It just takes a thing. And just this logs the thing. So here we go. I can log hello. Oop, I need to run this. This is node demo.js. Hello. Let's do another function. I'm just going to call this callback demo. This is just going to take a callback, what I'm going to call a callback. But what I'm really expecting is I'm expecting this callback to be a function. And I'm going to call that function inside of this function. This gets a little inception-y. So then I'm going to call this callback demo. I'm going to pass it my log. function. I'm just going to type in hello right here. Going to hard code this. So I have my log function, and this is why it's nice, because in Ruby you can't do this, because if I pass log in here, it would call the function. But with JavaScript, you know, I can pass around functions as if they were variables. Let's see what this says. So I can call this function, and I'm passing it a function. And this callback demo is actually going to call this function. So there's my hello. And when I log my log function, it just says function. So let me comment this out. Let's say we have another log function that says log function 1, and we'll do some interpolation too. Let's call this log. I'm going to rename these log 1, log 2. So they essentially do the same thing, but they have slightly different log messages. And then they can take in a parameter and interpolate it. Unexpected end of input. We're getting a curly bracket there. You're going to have a lot of fun with syntax errors in JavaScript. It's part of the pain. So like I have two log functions. I have log 1 and log 2. And the only difference is one says 1 and one says 2. So this is log function 1 and it's saying hello, because that's what my callback demo, it just calls the function with the string hello in it. But now I can also pass it a different function. So I'm giving this callback function log 1 and log 2. This is really important with JavaScript because JavaScript's like the language of the web. So let's say we have like inside of here, we have a handle click function. And it doesn't even need to take a parameter. We can say like, button was clicked. Go to, link. So on our website, we're going to have all these buttons, right? That when they get clicked or when some sort of event happens, we want them to fire. So what we can do is we can have these functions defined, and then we can wait until like there's like a const button clicked. And this can take a callback. And then we can call our callback. So when our button's clicked, eventually when someone clicks our button, well, then we can call the function. JavaScript, and it's not really JavaScript, it's just kind of like how the web is very asynchronous. Our code is not going to run from the start to the bottom. we have things like events and button clicks. So we're going to have to wait for those events to happen to handle them. So it's what's called asynchronous. It doesn't happen in order. It kind of just happens randomly. Not randomly, but out of order. It's not from top to bottom. I think this is a very confusing subject at the start. How's it? Any questions or anything with this?
Yeah, I'm a bit confused.
I would say I'm going to select this example out, go through and kind of see what's going on here as much as you can. But really, try not to overcomplicate it, because I think that's what I always did. I always made it more complicated. That's what I do a lot. I make it more complicated in my mind than it really is. We're just passing functions to functions. Like this log1, this is just a function. And I could call it like this. I could say log1 and then call it. Or I can actually call that. I could call that within this callback function, log1 ASDF or hello. Or I could just have this callback demo take in the function and just call it here. So I think you have to kind of look at it, code it, play around with it, and then kind of have it